So the FBN was created in July of 1930. It's allotted 250 agents to police the whole United States, with New York being its largest field office. New York was the center of drug trafficking early on, up to well into the 1970s. Largest, most active port in the world. Somewhere in the 1950s, passengers traveling by air, the numbers overtook passengers traveling by ship. So, New York being a hub of air traffic, one of the first, narcotics traffic went into the air. In a twist of fate, another 5 organizations were born in New York almost a year to date, like May of 1931. And in 1931, Salvatore Maranzano would declare himself boss of all bosses and create the 5 families of the New York Mafia. And the early story and most of its history is really about, especially in New York, is really about their battle with them. Not that there wasn't other ethnic groups and elements doing narcotics trafficking. There was a large Jewish element, mainly from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that was involved. Several tongs, Chinese tongs, probably the earliest smugglers of narcotics, specifically opium, were still involved into the 80s that I know of, into the 90s. The FBI didn't acknowledge the mafia to the 50s and didn't get around to huge investigations to the late 60s. I've read that in 1959, the FBI had only 4 agents working on organized crime. So the FBN was the only one investigating major bosses. And they had some great successes and locked up some major figures. They were mapping the mafia or Italian organized crime groups. If you go back before the FBN into old PO, the old Narcotics Bureau of Prohibition, I've read testimony from their agents that Italian gangs were partitioning up the city, specifically on the Lower East Side, South Brooklyn, and in East Harlem. And East Harlem would go on to become the heroin capital, the wholesaling heroin capital of the United States into the 70s. They would be the first to flip a made man, Joe Valachi, and who will go on to testify before the Senate. And that was a major turning point in the battle against organized crime. They would arrest Vito Genovese, Carmine Galanti, John Omento, all major bosses, all arrested for narcotics. In the case of Vito Genovese, looking like he got framed, which goes to their reputation. You know, they were lying in court. The problem dealing with organized crime is the corruption, and the first scandal would hit the FBN 1936, 6 years after it was created, and there were no indictments in that scandal, but few agents in that office survived it. Most were transferred or forced to resign. Narcotics agents are given a lot of leeway. They have to. They're chasing people around the globe, all over cities. And I think that there's not a lot of oversight and the lines really get blurred. There was a unit in the NYPD called the SIU, which came out of a joint investigation with the FBN, the French Connection case, the most popular version of it, 1961, But those agents, those NYPD detectives that were in on that case, they would go on to form the SIU, Special Investigations Unit, which went after major heroin traffickers. And they were called the Princes of the City. They had free will, jurisdiction, 5 boroughs. They didn't punch a time clock. They had no regular hours. They met in bars, restaurants, diners, and they chose their targets. And it went off the rails. 1974, they were disbanded. Major scandal, major corruption. I think 17 agents indicted. And I believe the FBN operated similarly. They had to. In New York, there was, in the 60s, there was 3 groups. Group 1, 2, and 3, 20 agents each with cliques inside those groups. And there was very little oversight. They would merge with the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control in 1968 to become the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And they were moved over from Treasury Department, which they were from their creation in 1930, to the Justice Department, where they belonged. But an investigation had started in 1967 by Andy Tartaglino, an FBN agent, a team leader, and he would be tasked with an integrity investigation. And once the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was formed, he was named as chief inspector. He would also serve as acting deputy administrator for the Drug Enforcement Agency. So what I'm going to quote to you now is some hearings before the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations at the 94th Congress, 1975, which he is testifying. And these hearings came about because he's starting an integrity investigation within the DEA already, which was formed. The BNDD became the DEA in 1973. So here's a quote. This is 1,400 pages. This testimony in this investigation. So it's really lengthy, but this is the most damaging portion of his testimony, because he's telling congressmen how it all really these investigations began, how it led into the DEA, and exactly what was going on in New York in 67, 69. So I'm just going to quote a little bit of him right now, and here we go. Quote: "An important turning point in our investigation of the New York office was the arrest and subsequent conviction of a former Bureau of Narcotics supervisor in New York for selling heroin to one of his informants. The situation found in New York in 1967-69 was this: corruption and questionable procedures were commonplace. Agents were engaged in illicit activities that included accepting bribes from all levels of traffickers, selling confiscated drugs and firearms, looting of search departments, providing tip-offs to suspects and defendants, and threatening the lives of fellow agents who dared to expose them. There was a complete breakdown of discipline and administrative management in the office. We found, for instance, that the file cabinet containing the names and payments to all informants in the New York region was normally not locked and located in an area that made it readily accessible to anyone who cared to inspect it. Not surprisingly, the office was experiencing an unusually large number of informant homicides. Some management and supervisory officials were utilizing establishments owned and operated by individuals with criminal connections and backgrounds. Our investigation revealed that between February 7, 1959 and early 1961, 3 separate incidents of the federal narcotics agents receiving emphasis on receiving overdoses of heroin went uninvestigated. One of the agents died in his own home shortly after receiving an overdose. The matter was investigated superficially some 2 years later, only after the wife brought pressure to bear by communicating with her congressman. Reliable information was developed that all three agents received orally administered overdoses because they attempted to extort money from traffickers who had arrangements with corrupt agents in that office. We also learned that earlier efforts to clean house by honest agents and supervisors were suppressed. So they're killing their own. One that we know of. And end quote. And they're killing informants. I'm going to read to you a headline in the New York Times, March 3rd, 1970. Headline: Murder of narcotics informants on the rise, law authorities report. The number of informants in the federal narcotic cases who have been murdered has reached substantial proportions in recent years. According to reliable law enforcement sources, federal prosecutors would not divulge the exact number, but other sources reported that it might be as high as over 100 in the last 15 years. Wow. And we have never learned the extent of the scandal. It's classified to this day. It's the Worm Report. So that's it, man. That's how they ended. And that legacy, that shady legacy, was passed into the DEA. And that's not to take away from all the brilliant cases that they had. I mean, really brilliant investigative cases. That is another legacy passed on to the DEA. They are probably the most capable law enforcement agency in the world, in my opinion. And you can ask any major narcotics trafficker anywhere in the world, Mexico, Colombia, if that's true. So that's the summary of what the FBM was before its merger into the BNDD in 1968, and that's the short version of the FBN.